This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream. Rishi Sunak is now the 57th Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and the second in a row to have no mandate from the people of the country. Therefore, it's unsurprising that he's already coming under pressure from the media, other MPs, and journalists to call a general election. However, as we'll get into in this video, the only real way that a general election can be called is either by the government or Prime Minister agreeing to it. Now, considering that the Tories are currently in excess of 30 points behind in the polls, it will be madness for the Conservatives to call an election right now. And that's because they'd probably lose it and be consigned to the opposition benches for years to come. So with this in mind, how could an election actually be called? Could Sunak U-turn? Well, let's take a look. If you like our videos, then be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when we release more UK content. So, let's start by going through the 3 different ways that a general election can be called: by a Prime Minister, by Parliament, and by the King. Let's start by taking a look at how the Prime Minister can call an election. Since the 2011 Fixed Term Parliaments Act was revoked last year, the Prime Minister is now able to determine the date of an election all by themselves. And this was actually the case historically too. But for the short period while the Fixed Term Parliaments Act was in place, the Prime Minister had this power stripped from them. That's because Parliament decided that instead of the Prime Minister deciding when, within a 5-year window, the election was to be held, the election would just take place every 5 years. However, as problems related to Brexit rattled on, Theresa May and then Boris Johnson found that they were unable to govern with their small majorities, and instead needed to call an election. Now, that's clearly difficult when you have a regimented election schedule. So, Parliament decided to use a get-out clause in order to call an election early. As such, it became clear that this new regimented system for elections just wasn't working. So, the whole Fixed Term Parliaments Act was revoked, and Prime Ministers were given back their prerogative power to be able to choose when, within a 5-year period, an election was to be called. Now, this is what's known as a prerogative power, which historically means that it's a power which the monarch used to hold. Prerogative powers include things like the ability to appoint ministers, the power to go to war, and of course, the power to call elections. Now, as the British Constitution has developed over time, these powers have been transferred to the Prime Minister. And it's important that we bear all of this in mind, as we'll come back to it later in the video to discuss whether the monarch could actually call an election. Anyway, that's how and why the Prime Minister is able to call a general election. With the Fixed Term Parliaments Act gone, they have the prerogative power to call an election whenever they want. So let's move on to the second group who have control: Parliament. In the era of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, Parliament could very easily decide on a general election. They could call an election early by either passing a one-line bill, basically saying, ignore the FTPA, let's have an election, or they could use a clause within the FTPA that allowed an election to be called with the consent of 2/3 of Parliament. Now, though, things are slightly harder. With the Fixed Term Parliament Act gone, Parliament no longer has the specific ability to call an election simply with the consent of 2/3 of Parliament. However, both in the FTPA era and now, Parliament does have an additional mechanism to call an election: a vote of no confidence. Now, a vote of no confidence doesn't directly call an election, but an election is the byproduct. Now, this effectively works by the House of Commons voting on a motion that says something along the lines of, this House does not have confidence in His Majesty's government, and if the no group wins, then the government falls. Now, in this situation, the King can invite another party leader to try and command the confidence of the House, and if successful, they could become the new Prime Minister. This is unlikely to happen, though, because it would involve the monarch engaging in politics, which they're usually reluctant to do. And regardless, it's often the case that only one leader can command confidence anyway. The only real situation where the King could realistically do this is when neither Labour or the Conservatives have a majority, and as such, they rely on a third party to form the government. If said third party decided that they wanted to swap from backing, say, the Conservative government to a Labour opposition, then the king could invite the leader of Labour to form a government without an election. Now, the last time that a monarch got involved in politics in this way was in 1924. So it's much more likely that if the government lost the vote of no confidence, that a general election would just be called instead, and Keir Starmer would never be invited to form a government. Anyway, that's what normally happens when a government loses such a vote, and how it can trigger a general election. Okay, so let's move on to the last way that a general election can be called, through the monarch dissolving parliament. As we said at the start, the Prime Minister has the power to call an election through the prerogative powers provided to them by the monarch. In theory, then, the monarch could take back that power and call an election on their own. This, though, would be unprecedented in modern times and would certainly cause a constitutional crisis. Anyway, those are the three ways that an election can be called: by the Prime Minister, by Parliament, and by the monarch. So, how likely is this to happen by any of the three routes? Well, looking at polling, the Conservatives have been at historic lows against Labour over the last few weeks and months. Under Prime Minister Liz Truss, the Conservatives fell to their lowest polling numbers since the late 1990s. Now, as Sunak is relatively new to the job, polling about him as Prime Minister isn't all that reliable, but it's likely they're still fairly significantly behind. Now, while there are some preliminary polls that suggest voters prefer him to Truss, it's worth noting that he's still behind Labour in such polling. So Sunak is likely very aware that if he was to call an election now, he's probably not going to win it. Additionally, he'll have seen exactly what happened to Theresa May in 2017 when she called a snap election. And to be fair, she was actually ahead in the polls when she called the election and ended up losing her majority. So imagine what would happen if Sunak called one when he was behind in the polls. And this is exactly the same problem when we look at whether Parliament will vote for an election. The Conservatives have a majority of 69 in the House of Commons, so about 35 of them would have to choose to vote no confidence in their own government, knowing that due to the unfavourable polling, they would likely lose their majority, and with it, their job, which is a bit of a tall order, and as such, pretty unlikely. Additionally, the idea that the king could intervene is far-fetched and incredibly unlikely, as we alluded to a moment ago. The point is then that while there are ways for an election to be called, none of them are particularly good at the moment. So it looks like the Conservatives could easily continue ruling until 2024, when an election is set to be called anyway. Now, that's quite a long way to wait, so if you want to keep yourself entertained, check out this. Last year, Team TLDR congregated for the first annual political pumpkin carving competition.
Each team member had 15 minutes to carve a random politician's face into a pumpkin before the others had to guess who they'd carved.
Everyone was furious at last year's result, so we brought the game back from the dead for round 2.
This time though, we headed to Rory's farm in Essex to up the game.
This time it was also a lot more serious and a lot more competitive.
Who did we carve?
Who won the contest?
Find out in TLDR's second annual political pumpkin carving contest, exclusively on Nebula.
If you want to watch that video, along with a ton of other exclusive content, then you should head over to Nebula. That's a streaming service that we made with a bunch of our creator friends, and where we post exclusive explainers and some fun videos too, like our team attempting the British citizenship or our blooper reel. On Wednesday, Peru's Prime Minister, oh God, I'm just going to ask next door, I'll be back. Turns out there's a bunch of useless next door. Nebula viewers also get many of our videos before YouTube, as well as all of our content ad-free. Now, if you want to sign up, the best way to do that right now is with the Nebula Curiosity Stream deal. That way, if you sign up to Curiosity Stream, home to some of the best documentaries available online, you'll also get Nebula included absolutely free. That means 2 streaming services for less than $15 a year. Anyway, thanks for supporting the channel, and click the link in the description to check out Nebula and the pumpkin video.